Good afternoon. Can you all hear me in the back? I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Wes, for the invitation. I've had some contacts with Los Alamos and Sandia, but this is the first direct contact I have with Livermore, and I'm so happy so far from the people I met and the experience I've had over a beautiful sandwich lunch. But I'm particularly impressed to see the younger generation of leadership here through the student interns. It always pleases me to see students interested in developing careers in whatever field we have in this country, because I think it is time that we gray beards turn over the mantle to the younger generation. But the younger generation, before they begin to make fun of the gray beards, I would just like to remind them that it's taken years and years to get where we are. And I hope you focus on that. And you will see from my first slide that there is, in the long run, and this is only for the students, not for the elderly and more senior in this crowd, that there is no substitute for expertise. That whatever your field is, senior policymakers turn to you not because of the color of your hair or the color of your eyes, but because of your expertise. So this is what you really need to develop as we go on. So the point that Wes kindly, in his kind introduction, did not mention is that I always like to remind people that I kind of, once in a while, I speak with an accent. So the other day I was in the downtown Albuquerque, and so I met a person, and she said, "Oh, you speak with an accent. Where do you come from?" I said, "I come from the northeast heights of the city. We speak funny up there." She kind of thought, oh, she didn't question it at all. So you ought to question what you hear from now on. So what he didn't mention is that I always say I was born in Nazareth. This is the real Nazareth, not the one in Pennsylvania. And I always say two of us come from there. One was crucified, and I've been running ever since. So I am here today to talk to you about the Middle East, ISIS, and all the mess that is going on over there. I have, gladly, I included a slide on Saudi, because the terror acts in Saudi Arabia in the last day or two really highlight the significance of that country and where ISIS is going. Just my background I wanted to mention before I get into that. I had a long career in academia, and then I went to CIA for another career, and now I have my third career in consulting and at UNM. I basically do not believe in retirement. My wife says I flunked the retirement the day I retired, and she was, of course, correct. I just moved from one station to the next. Now, going to the Middle East, the first point I want to make is that, like everything else, whether ISIS, whether the Middle East, whether particular countries, the Islamic world, including the Middle East, is very complex. So we need to understand this whole theory of complexity. And to figure complexity, you need to have expertise, both in languages, culture, and all the religious narratives. I mean, the debate today, my most recent piece was about the terms. You know, there's been debate in this country whether we should use radical Islamic radicalism or not. On one side, they say we should use that. The president says we shouldn't. I wrote a piece exactly on what does that mean and why the president is correct, why we shouldn't use these terms that do not tell us much, but that muddle the issue. So you need to dig deeper into that. And we hear also, of course, Sunni, we hear Saudi Arabia and Iran, oh, that's Shia Sunni. Well, it's more than that. It's not just Shia Sunni. What about the struggle for power? What about democratization versus dictatorship? So these issues are deeper issues that we need to focus on. And the last point here I want to make is that we and the Middle East have been intertwined for decades. And you hear people say the United States should get the heck out of there and leave that region. The fact is we can't. The fact is we are a superpower with interests that run across the world. If you look at the map of the Middle East today, you will find militarily alone, we are either in every country or next to every country in the region. Just militarily. We're not talking about education, commerce, culture. So we are intertwined with that region for years to come. So the point I want to make is that it's very easy to say, let's leave and let them figure out their own problems. The last part of the statement might be correct, but it's not easy to leave. And what perhaps people from the Middle East need is more clarity as to where we stand in terms of our policies. I'm talking about this balance between the big V, values, what define us, what make us what we are, and the big I, interests. So this balance between interests and values is really the biggest challenge that is going to face us over the next 5 to 10 years. And don't underestimate that. We have discovered that recent historical lessons have taught us that focusing on one and not the other doesn't work. That we have to come up with a functional balance to keep our values intact, but at the same time to pursue our interests. That is not necessarily it's not necessarily a real separation, but I think it's a false straw man, because we can do both. And we have done both over the years. We followed our interests during the Cold War to dismantle the Soviet Union and to defeat communism, but we also pursued our values as well. And if it worked then, I cannot see why it would not work over the next 5 to 10 years in specific regions. So the Middle East today is just, you already read it yourself. The status report is basically the summary of this region now, is that it is basically in a mess. This is a highly scientific term, but the region is in a mess. And I don't mean mathematically chaos theory I'm talking about a real mess, right? The only positive sign that I see in the region is the P5+1 agreement with Iran. I mean, really, that's the only sign of hope I see in the region. The other sign of hope you might find is in a small country of Tunisia, where democracy is slowly but surely taking root. The second point is not raising any debate. The first one, you might have debates about it, which I would be very happy to discuss. I am a very strong supporter. I have been from day one of the Iran deal. And there was a lot of debate in Washington and outside Washington about it. But it was an important agreement that for the first time in recent negotiations, diplomatic negotiations, where experts were involved in the negotiation on a daily basis. This is the first time where you saw the Secretary of Energy, who was expert in his field, at the table doing the negotiation, where our scientists from the labs, particular labs involved, were answering questions in real time that were posed by the negotiators. And if it's good for our scientists, I think it's good for me. And I think this offers a tremendous opportunity if Iran accepts the deal and lives by the deal and reintegrates in the international community. The Middle East 5 years from now, I want to borrow a phrase from Global Trends 2035. This is the National Intelligence Council report. It has not come out. It will not come out before late November, early December. But I saw a draft of it, and I like that phrase. Basically, what we focus on is how people prosper, live, think, govern, and fight. You know, if we understand that, then we begin to unlock the mysteries of what makes people tick and what makes countries tick. And unfortunately for the region, over the next 5 years, it's a mixed picture, but for the most part is negative. And you see increased volatility, both, on all levels, political, economic, and social. And that volatility undermines certainty and therefore increases uncertainty. And in an environment of uncertainty, it becomes difficult for our policymakers to make long-term decisions because the situation is uncertain. Anemic job creation. Now you say, well, we have unemployment here, so why bother? Well, of course, when you look at the age group across the greater Middle East, from Turkey to Pakistan, in the ages of 15 to 29, the rates of unemployment range from the most optimistic 25% to the most pessimistic 70%. So when you have 70% of the young men and women, let's focus on men for a while because many of them, most of the radicals and terrorists and so on end up being men, but there are some women. But when you focus on that group, that 70% of the young men and women in Gaza are unemployed, then you begin to wonder what is their optimistic view of the future. The same thing in Egypt, the same thing in Saudi Arabia, not 70%, but unemployment in Saudi Arabia among that cohort group is close to 25%. Of course, the government tells you it's 15%, but most governments lower their rates of unemployment. And so that is a very major threat that we are going to face over the next 5 to 10 years. Whereas governments used to be the main employers, they no longer can be the main employers. You know, there was a law in Egypt that Nasser started back in the 50s, that every college graduate should have a job. And so if you have hundreds of thousands of college graduates, then you have to create hundreds of thousands of government jobs. And so the end result is that the Egyptian bureaucracy emerged as one of the most bloated bureaucracies in the world. If you go to a hotel, if you have been to Egypt and you go to a hotel, let's say in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, on every floor, you see somebody sitting in the corner on a chair. And I knew these people must be college graduates. So I would go to them and ask them a question in Arabic. I don't say, did you go to school or what are you doing here? I ask him, what school did you go to? And so he just say, whatever school, and your BA in what? And he tells me his BA in what? You know, mostly liberal arts, mostly social studies, mostly literature, and so on. And I said, so what are you doing on this floor? He would say, well, I'm minding the floor. So what does that mean? I had no idea. But it's a job, and a job with very little pay. And so that little pay produces corruption, whether it's a policeman or a professor or a government minister. So unemployment becomes, and then the environmental degradation, something that you don't think much about. Of course, you should in California, correct? But throughout the region, the environment has been totally destroyed. Drinking water is rapidly disappearing. Yemen might be the first state in the world to go dry. No fresh water. 15 million kids a year die of drinking polluted water worldwide. A year. And the garbage collection, the sewer system, the environment as a whole, agriculture has been affected severely by it. So it's a vicious circle. As the environment is degraded, agricultural produce is diminished, hunger goes up, and poverty goes up. So if you remember that book by the British economist about the bottom 1 billion, which was written about 15 years ago, a distinguished British economist at Oxford. Today, that type of economist would write a book titled The Bottom 2 Billion, which means 2 billion, doubled that type of poverty. To a large extent, environmental degradation contributes to that. Now, expanding technology, and we'll talk about that in the symposium tomorrow, digitalization and virtual networks. This is expanding, and it's amazing that this is the type of threat that we need to look at. And personally, please forgive me, not you who are working on it, but we as a nation have not really focused really seriously on this type of threat. They might not have fancy weapons to attack us, but they can easily learn hacking and cyber war and cyber security. And you find kids in Gaza or kids in China or kids wherever hacking into our systems. And the rule that I have learned, that whatever we do to them today, I am convinced they will be able to do to us tomorrow in the level of in cyber. And so this technology is something that we really truly have not. We have always admitted that we are playing defense in technology, but I think we should have the honesty and to say we are now developing an offensive weapon in technology. That cyber is the weapon of the future and should be one of those. And then, as I said, the Iran deal. So these are on the social levels that are also of issue to us. So they have these disconnects. You know, high individual expectations which gave rise to the Arab Spring versus low government performance. High demands for democratization, increased dictatorship. And autocracy today already is in the saddle in those countries, right? Religious identities versus sectarian violence. We have seen in the region, and in other countries, by the way, the salience of religion as a factor in foreign policy. But we have seen also, in a religion like Islam, that the religious identity has given way to several sub-identities, which is really sectarianism. So the nation state, some might argue that we see that in our country today. This is only a political comment, and the only political comment I will make, is that the nation is becoming more devolving into tribes. That we are becoming tribal. Those countries are becoming tribal. So the nation state is devolving into tribal identities. When I say tribal, I don't mean the traditional tribes. I mean the different groups, different networks, as Josh Ramos says in his book, of tribes. Might be religious groups, sectarian groups, ethnic groups, and the identities are being devolved to that level and away from the nation state. So the nation state is becoming in the region, and I know people and writers in political science and others have written for years about the demise of the nation state. And this is not another theoretical discussion about the demise of the nation state. But this is a real discussion about the diminishing value of the state particularly in the area of legitimacy, credibility, and affiliation between the individuals and the state, and the rise of non-state actors, both nice and nefarious. Unfortunately, the nefarious have taken the public space more than the nice non-state actors. And population dislocations, of course, the refugees and so on. But finally here, this securitization of the state. The only area, ladies and gentlemen, where the state remains supreme is in the securitization of the society. So we see today, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, much more securitized than they ever were. So the state has become more and more of a security apparatus rather than a state that people respect, pay taxes to, and associate with, and seek security from, rather than run away from, do not identify with, do not pay taxes to, and continuously cheat. So this securitization in the short term is supporting the regime, but in the long term is not going to work because it didn't work, and that's what the Arab Spring showed us. Now, so the next point I want to talk is about terrorism, and the first point I want to bring to your attention is that if you look at the map, you will see a real change in the geography of terrorism. You know, the good old days when Al-Qa'ida, we knew where Al-Qa'ida was in a sense, and they attacked us and so on, and we went to a country and destroyed the Taliban regime at the time. Of course, they are now being resurrected. It was specific location. Now, if you look at the region from Europe all the way to Indonesia, you find that's becoming part of the new geography, the new map of terrorism. It's making it much more difficult, much more. And the other day there was a big article in the New York Times about the rise of Wahhabi Islam in the Balkans, in Kosovo. One of my last TDYs before I left the government was to the Balkans. And they raised that problem with me, that they were concerned that Wahhabism was, through money, was making inroads in the Balkans. And I went to those countries. And they were already afraid. And now, over 15 years later, you see that article in the New York Times about the rise of Wahhabism in Kosovo and in the Balkans. But that's across. And so keep that in mind, please, when you think about terrorism. Now, you heard about Boko Haram and the kidnapping of women and girls there, and then all of a sudden Boko Haram declared allegiance to ISIS. Well, Boko Haram in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria. I used to go to those places, perhaps the worst places on God's earth, and in some of those villages up in the north. And all of a sudden you say, why is ISIS there? Why is ISIS in Bangladesh? So you have to take a view of the whole. If you go to the Sahel countries, you see a tremendous strength of this type of ideology. So ISIS, of course, you hear of ISIS. This is elementary to most of you, but the names change, but the movement is the same, right? So it used to be, it's now ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. In the Middle East, they don't use ISIS. They use Daesh, Dawla Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Sham, which is the acronym for ISIS in Arabic. And it started Al-Qa'ida in Iraq, Zarqawi, and then Baghdadi took over, and it became ISIS. But the interesting thing about ISIS, of course, to us is a terrorist organization. it is a terrorist organization. And you would say, well, why so many Muslims, Sunnis support it? Of course, keep in mind, it's a Sunni group, not a Shia group. It's a Sunni group against Shia. So many Sunnis support that ideology. Many Sunnis, Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, don't support the terror of ISIS, but they find the ideology of ISIS not alien. So that's important. Also, you find mainstream nationalists who support ISIS because ISIS says they are breaking down the Sykes-Picot regime that was created exactly 100 years ago. Sykes-Picot, where Sykes was a Britisher and Picot Frenchman, and they agreed together in a secret agreement that was signed in May 1916 to divide the territories of what is known as the Levant, the heart of the Near East, which later came to be called Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and so on, among themselves. So the French would take North Africa and Syria and Lebanon. The British would take every other place, and so on, you see. And so many even nationalists think that's a colonial regime. Of course it's a colonial regime. So when ISIS says we are removing those boundaries, some support that. Keep that in mind. So different groups support ISIS for different reasons, although most groups abhor the vulgar terrorism that they conduct. Now, in this slide, it's basically not a rocket science, excuse the pun in here at the lab. This is not, an ISIS or a terrorist organization doesn't appear out of nowhere, correct? I mean, a kid doesn't get up in the morning and say, gee, thank you, Lord, it's a beautiful sunny sky today, I'm going to be a terrorist. It just doesn't happen that way. So there is a context. So ISIS did not emerge out of nowhere. Of course, the immediate thing was in Iraq, but there were two major critical drivers that have always underpinned ISIS. The first is this intolerant radical ideology, Sunni ideology, which mostly emanates from Saudi Arabia. It's ironic that it's coming home to roost, that most jihadists in ISIS are Saudis, and now Saudi Arabia is in ISIS's crosshairs, as is Jordan, the Hashemite. And the second is domestic politics. I mean, if those other issues that Global Trends 2035 will be talking about, lack of governance, poor governance, corruption, repression, poverty, unemployment, underemployment, sectarianism, perceived Islamic policies by Western powers, and then the Arab-Israeli conflict. So these factors that have contributed to the rise of these groups to a large extent are still there. And we need to address those if we ultimately need to address ISIS beyond defeating ISIS today. So we talk about ISIS resiliency. Why is ISIS seemingly so resilient? Well, I looked at the key factors that have given ISIS this type of resiliency, right? So the first factor is the success factor. The blitzkrieg that ISIS did, expansion and conquering territory so quickly, so fast, against such huge odds militarily, created a certain allure among young people in other parts of the world. So the success factor, success begins to breed success. That's the first one. The second is brutality and obedience. When you go to Raqqa, that is the Syrian capital of ISIS, or to Mosul or Fallujah before they lost Fallujah, you see they rule with terror. I mean, you can have a safe life and nobody would touch you if you do not say a word against ISIS, if you accept their regulations without any question, and if you do what they asked you to do. So If women have to be covered, they are covered. If you cannot play music in public, you cannot play music in public. And if you do, you are punished. And not punished with, read you the Miranda rights. No Miranda in ISIS. So you are lucky if you are not killed. You are fortunate if you are only jailed, beaten up and jailed. But for the most part, they don't have too many jails, so, the other choice. The two critical, pivotal factors to me are resources and territory. And this is why I used to argue with the administration when I used to brief the administration. Say, don't talk about degrading, defeating ISIS. Talk about those two, focus on those two factors. ISIS continues to expand resource-wise and territory-wise. That expansion continues to attract recruits. But when you contain ISIS territorially and contain ISIS resource-wise in terms of money, banking, and so on, then that begins to dry it up. This is the only way that we can focus on these factors. Those other factors are important. Those are factors that are important for ISIS jihad or ISIS fighting against the near enemy, their immediate regimes, and the far enemy. That's their factors to recruit and everything else. But I think we should not even spend effort and money on that. We should spend effort and money on the resources and territory, which we are doing now, in a sense. The problem, and so the key judgment from this slide is that the resiliency factor wane as ISIS is more contained. Now, ISIS and Al-Qa'ida, you say, well, we've had Al-Qa'ida, so now we have ISIS. But they are similar and they are not similar, right? They are similar in their ideology. They both belong to the same narrative of Sunni, radical Sunni narrative, right? Now, they are different in terms of their jihadism and in terms of their fighters. ISIS fighters are much more lethal, much more war-tested, battlefield-tested, more used to sophisticated weapons than Al-Qa'ida ever was. I mean, when I used to talk to some Al-Qa'ida detainees, and I would ask, how is your jihad, or how did they identify their jihad generally by their proximity to bin Laden. So one would tell you, oh, I was in his inner circle, or I was in his middle circle, or I was in his outer circle, or I fled with bin Laden through Tora Bora. In other words, their proximity to bin Laden defined their jihad. ISIS is much more battlefield-oriented jihad. So they are more dangerous. They are more lethal, more dangerous, and more committed to the cause. The main difference also is that both wanted to have a caliphate with territory. Otherwise, a caliphate without territory becomes a blog. They needed territory with the caliphate, and they needed, in a sense, to declare a caliphate and occupy a territory. That was what bin Laden struggled for. And that's what ISIS struggled for. Whereas Al-Qa'ida lost on both counts, could not attain either a caliphate or a territory, ISIS attained both. The second, which is more critical to us now, is that whereas Al-Qa'ida has moved from the global to the local, we are seeing ISIS moving from the local to the global. That's where the danger of ISIS is. I mean, if ISIS stayed in Raqqa, in Syria, and Iraq, and Jordan, honestly, it's bad for those countries, but it doesn't really affect us much. But as they come under more pressure and they strike outward, that's where their globalism becomes much more lethal to us. Now, the threat to the United States, I want to put this slide up because just to show, we have a few people arrested or few people commit crimes and a few people kill few people, and we've had our share of terror. But really in the overall strategic level, the threat to Europe is much more important, much more real than the threat to the United States. And to a large extent, one of the reasons is that we don't have what they call in Europe an Islamic problem in this country. We have Islamophobia and we have a lot of people talking against Islam, but we have not had an Islamic problem. Namely, we don't have uniquely Islamic poverty groups. We don't have Islamic ghettos. We don't have Islamic exclusionism in this country. In fact, the Pew poll in 2007, about 8-9 years back, ran a public opinion poll about American Muslims. It was very interesting, the Pew Research Center. And the poll showed that Muslims in this country, on the average, are more educated than the rest of the population, more economically prosperous than the rest of the population, and they are in every walk of life. I mean, there isn't a field of study, from space science to Hollywood to sports, that you don't find Muslims in. So this exclusion that we experience in Europe with Muslim communities, of course it varies from country to country. We don't have here. We're not experienced here. So we have not had an Islamic problem. And that's, to me, the main reason, because in the long run, ladies and gentlemen, it's engaging the community is what is going to help law enforcement authorities to spot a potential lone wolf, for example. If a person, because most studies have showed you, intelligence studies and public studies, open source studies, have shown that when a kid who is a normal kid all of a sudden becomes a terrorist or a killer, they normally go through a change in behavior. A kid might play sports with his teams in high school, and all of a sudden he withdraws from sports. A kid who doesn't even pray, all of a sudden he starts going to the mosque. A kid who drinks and goes to nightclubs, all of a sudden he stops doing that. So there is a change in behavior. And so this behavioral change, law enforcement authorities cannot spot it easily. It has to have the community, whether it's the immediate family or the neighborhood, talk about this change. And that has to come from engaging the community. I call it Muslim world engagement. But this is just not global, but local. NYPD has done a tremendous job in doing that. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Force has done a very good job doing that. And this phrase, see something, say something, that is not an easy phrase. Unless that person believes that this is his country and this is his city, is not going to go to law enforcement and squeal on a co-religionist that guy potentially is a bad dude. They're not going to. But when people believe that this is part of their country, when that Muslim guy in New York went to law enforcement and told them about that guy who did not know how to blow up the car, and they asked him, why did you do that? He said, but this is my city. I don't want anything to happen to my city. And the same thing with those 2 Canadian Muslims who went to the authorities about those potential terrorists. And they said, Canada is our country. I don't want anything bad to happen to our country. Until this relationship occurs, which has occurred in this country and has yet to occur in Europe. So I think for all of these reasons, I think the threat is minimal, although it is there. And I worry about the infrastructure through through cyber. The threat there is not just to go physically and blow that infrastructure. I truly worry about potential cyber threat to these infrastructures. Now, I don't want to spend more time on Saudi Arabia except to say that Saudi Arabia is undergoing a very, very major internal restructuring. They are in an identity crisis. Saudi Arabia has followed a quietist foreign policy. All of a sudden, with the new young deputy crown prince, is reaching out and wanted to become the leader of the Middle East. They can do it well. They don't know how to do it well. But what concerns me more about Saudi Arabia is that they potentially can cause a war with Iran, not because of Sunni-Shia, but because of struggle for power. And that they continue to export that type of ideology. You know, that's the only Islam that they know, mostly, Wahhabi Islam, and comes out of Saudi Arabia. It's a very difficult problem. That's what they teach in their schools. That's what their young men learn. This narrow-minded, intolerant, inward-looking narrative of their faith. Which means not only they don't trust Christians and Jews, they don't trust other Muslims who disagree with them, and they consider the Shia worse than the Christians and the Jews. And therefore they are subject to be killed. You see, so those wars are happening in Saudi Arabia. And then Saudi Arabia is going through power struggle, quiet but real, within the country. The crown prince is not terribly healthy. In fact, he is sick. And will the deputy crown prince change the succession system and become a king? And there's a debate within the royal family. There are some who are pushing him to change the succession, which means will create an internal power struggle. And ISIS will certainly take advantage of this internal power struggle. Saudi Arabia is not really and I think we need to pay close attention to what's happening in Saudi Arabia. In the region, Saudi Arabia is floundering, is conducting a war in Yemen, doesn't know what to do with it, right? Is not successful, has not attained its objectives. They want to get out of it. They came to us to help them extricate themselves from it. And yet at the same time, they feel their oaths and they are pretty critical of the United States. And as I said, in the next decade, domestic instability, search for identity, questionable legitimacy, restless, unemployed, and alienated youth, and royal family fracturing are all bound to increase, which means their stability will decrease and instability will go up. I mean, the U.S., their relationship with the U.S., we've had a very strong relationship since FDR and Ibn Saud met in 1945. But now we have diminishing reliance on Saudi oil. We disagree over Iran. We disagree over Syria. We disagree over the war in Yemen. There is U.S. anxiety over radical Sunni ideology. There's Saudi anxiety over U.S.-Iranian relations. There's Saudi anxiety over changing the Middle East and the U.S. posture in the Middle East. So our relationship with Saudi Arabia is, for the first time in over 70 years, is undergoing serious re-examination at a time when Saudi Arabia now is in the crosshairs of ISIS. So it's a very serious situation. I don't want to spend time here except to say that the situation in Syria remains terrible. That dictator remains in place. And I have certain views and I've written about that. And the fact is that here you have a case where a dictator is willing literally to destroy his country, kill off his people in order to stay in power. This is the only reason that dictator is doing this war, in order to stay in power. There's no other reason at all. And the international community, to a large extent, has indirectly allowed him to do that. Now, the way forward, ISIS is being contained, but their regional threat continues and global threat. Balancing, as I said in the beginning, the values and interests is a key challenge to us. Autocracy remains in the saddle, but their security of those countries is not any better. The ideas behind the Arab Spring remain valid today, although counter-revolution has destroyed most of those movements. But the ideas have not gone. The ideas, for the first time in the history of the Arab nation state since Sykes-Picot, you see millions out in the streets demonstrating not against foreign powers or against colonialism or against Israel or against Zionism. They were demonstrating against their own dictators for the first time. Movements from within, not supported from the outside, not egged on by CIA, not egged on by any group. They are from within. So those ideals cannot disappear overnight. And that's why dictators are becoming more entrenched and more autocratic, because they want to beat those ideals and they have been unable to do so. The U.S., as I said, remains a pivotal player, but in the end, those other issues are key. Now I say, what about if we don't deal with those issues? Very briefly and simply, if we don't deal with these issues, I can guarantee you that in the next 5 years, in the next 2 years, if ISIS is defeated tomorrow, we will have another terrorist organization, perhaps with a different name, that will come on the scene. Which means if we are not dealing with those critical factors that drive terrorism and drive groups like ISIS, we will continue to fight yesterday's wars instead of anticipating tomorrow's developments. And of course, many policymakers are concerned about their too-weak inbox, and so they have to fight the immediate threat. And that's fair and understandable. But for us as a country, over the next 5 to 10 years, if I strongly recommend you read Global Trends 2035 when it comes out, that you will find that over the next 5 to 10 years, those issues are going to be there and they are affecting us. When you see these immigrants, these refugees from Africa, these are not war refugees from Syria. They are economic refugees, which means unemployment in those countries is affecting us as well. The same thing with diseases. And so these issues have to be dealt with if we are going to hopefully put an end, break this cycle of every few years another terrorist organization. The Obama doctrine, of course, I recommend this article in The Atlantic, in which he gave several interviews to Goldberg and was published back in April. And he said, okay, regional states must share in moving the region forward. He talked about no free riders or freeloaders, and they criticized him. The Saudis and others criticized him very strongly. But he's correct that we need to work with those states, but they need to carry their share and not start a war in Yemen like Saudi Arabia and came to the U.S. to help them extricate themselves from it. So no free riders. And the final thing I would say, I would like to recommend those 2 books by Kaplan. It's called Dark Territory, the history of secret cyber war, the secret history of cyber war, and the other one by Joshua Cooper Ramo called The Seventh Sense. If you put those 2 books on your summer reading list, I would be very happy and you would learn a lot from them. Thank you very much.